Hey Chris, webinar day, another exciting day. How you doing today?
I'm doing great, Ron. Yeah, it's going to be exciting. Today we're going to be talking about EDI, and this is something that I think a lot of folks kind of hear the word EDI or the phrase, and they think, ugh. It's an
Right?
older technology, but for those who have worked with it, it's extremely reliable, and it's something that we always talk with our internal team when we're explaining the power of EDI. And the way I like to explain it is it's something that just works. It just
Yeah.
works. And, because of that, a lot of ERP systems, a lot of, point of sale systems, manufacturing system, I mean, really a lot of systems take advantage of EDI as their mechanism for communicating. And specifically in certain industries, there's a lot of just kind of overall investment that's gone into EDI that the entire industry can rely on to exchange information internally. So I'm really excited to dig into this and kind of, remove some of the negativity that might exist around this, older technology, but I would say very proven technology as well.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it's been around for well over 20 years. 85% of the supply chain uses it. It's kind of the de facto standard, right? It's like no matter what language everybody speaks from all the different countries, if everybody can at least speak one language to communicate the basics, and that's kind of what this is. It's like I used to akin this to the old fax machine, right? Everybody could fax, and then kind of we did away with fax finally when it took over. But EDI, matter of fact, when I'm selling and talking to a lot of clients and they're setting up their supply chain, it's always been EDI. And then it's only been probably the last 2 or 3 years where they're coming in saying, hey, you know, that EDI we set up 8 years ago, I've got a couple of my vendors now that are coming back and they want more real-time communication. So they're looking to upgrade to an API. Can we go ahead and swap out our EDI connection with them for an API connection? And we're starting to redo some of those. And I think, and we'll talk briefly today about a van as well. I think that's kind of what the van tried to do. I think the van tried to renew EDI and take away some of the complexity of the point-to-point connections and introduce some of that additional benefit so that you didn't have to go in and rip and replace these independent connections. So let's talk briefly. Why don't you go ahead and just give the definition of EDI from just a basic functional architecture?
Yeah, absolutely. So just from an architecture perspective, and I guess to get the elephant in the room out too, EDI, electronic data interchange, and like the mechanics of this are it's typically a flat file, and it's a really simple file. If you ever look at one of them, and we can put a screenshot up so you can see that. We'll show a few examples of different types of EDI files. The flat text file, and this actually started in the 1960s and started to get a lot of momentum, kind of in the 80s and 90s. And there were some different organizations that created standards for EDI that really helped it take off in the 90s in particular. And so you end up with these kind of two camps. One, generally speaking, and there are very detailed kind of industry specific camps, but you have X12, which is pretty prominent in the US, and then EDI Fax, which is very prominent in Europe. And there's a lot more nuance to it than that. But suffice it to say, if you want to chat about it offline, feel free to get in touch with us. I will love to chat with you for however long to get into it and nerd out. But just for the high level purpose of this discussion, it's a flat file, and they're within the kind of standards. You then have different document types. And so just think of it as like a set of document types. And then each standard, whether it's X12 or EDI Fact, and unfortunately within each of those, there are specifics for different industries with standards. So you make sure that everyone's using the same standard, or that there's a translation mechanism. And that's what Ron was talking about with VAN. And that stands for Value Added Network. And basically the idea is it's essentially a sophisticated FTP site that's going to allow people to push and pull files. And then it has a lot of kind of transactional, governance that allows for the data that you're pushing, these flat files, to kind of, run in a very organized and orderly fashion. Because if you can imagine, Ron, like sending thousands of EDI files for orders at scale every second, and some, blip in the network occurs, and then 1,200 orders are dropped, that just wouldn't do the job very well. So really, as this kind of evolution of EDI started to happen, and think about it, I mean, in the 90s and the early 2000s, there weren't as many options that were standardized. And so EDI was really heavily, a big, heavy investment that a lot of players in the ERP space and some of these different major software vendors, they took advantage of that and piled into EDI. And so Van kind of allowed it, like you said, to have more legs and be much more kind of strongly typed, or kind of transactional guarantees. So whenever you send something, you get a receipt that you've sent it, depending on the van and how sophisticated it is. And whenever you receive something, you can get a notification. So it almost becomes like a pub sub or a service bus, which a lot of folks will be familiar with as well. And so you can take advantage of security, VPN, tunneling, etc. So EDI really is a functional, very viable technology for interchanging data between systems. And because it has so much investment in it, it's just going to continue to have a lot of inertia, a lot of momentum into the future with industries that use it all the time, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, we still sell it and we still do it right now. I mean, we've got one of our largest clients right now and we're working on their project. And I just put a video together for them. And they're connected to Coca-Cola and Chick-fil-A and all these big vendors. And it's all through EDI, right? And one of our other big ones we did a while ago was for a company called Laser Pros. It's probably one of the biggest companies you've never heard of. And just as a quick example for the folks listening in, so Laser Pros was our client. They came to us and they said, we supply all of the toner cartridges for laser printers for every single online order that comes through Staples and Office Max and Office Depot or anything. So we had to set up an entire, using our Clarity Connect, we set up the entire infrastructure and network so that every order and acknowledgement and tracking shipping that came in from, let's just take staples.com, I would get online, I would order a printer cartridge. They would dump a file, which our system would pick up that EDI file, take it to Laser Pros, generate the print label from Staples along with that file, hand it off to Laser Pros, which could automate the shipping of that toner cartridge. And when it showed up at your business, the label would say that it was from Staples, and then the acknowledgement back that it was shipped and the tracking status and everything would go back in a file that we would go back and hand off to Staples so they could update the website so that when you go in and look online and see, has it been confirmed? Has it been shipped? All that information, as far as they're concerned, they only deal with Staples, but yet all the transactional information, everything that happens, the delivery and everything actually was with our client, Laser Pros. And like you said, at scale, we're dealing with incredibly huge companies ordering, tens of thousands of orders. And that's one of the last big ones that I know we did. I know we're just finishing up the one with the client dealing with all the orders from Coca-Cola and Chick-fil-A and those as well. So this is definitely not something small. It's definitely not something little. Like you can see here on the slide, 85% of orders through the supply chain and through buying groups basically come through EDI. So let's kind of dive in and have you give us some of the best practices, kind of give the audience and tell them kind of obviously some of the easy things, bullet number one, automatically place orders without human interaction. Obviously, that's a good one, right?
Yeah.
But there's other things too about, deduping and proactive notifications, some of the things that you started mentioning with the van. And some of these other things, I definitely want you to drill down a little further into some of them.
Absolutely. And it is really interesting because per industry there are nuances that make a lot of sense. So I'll dive into a couple of these, and I hope that this is helpful for the audience possibly for your industry. And one of the things we want you to think about is, what are the nuances in my space that are going to make sense from what Ron and Chris are talking about? And what are some that, don't necessarily? So like you said, Ron, the main thing here in general is this kind of automation of what would otherwise be a manual process or a less effective process, right? So everything that we possibly can, we want to be able to validate in this type of format. Now, the reality whenever you're dealing with automation is there will almost always be edge cases. So we highly recommend setting up a testing environment, a development, staging, UAT, and production. I mean, depending on the scale at which you're operating, it makes sense to have all of those environments. If you're operating at a smaller scale, you can scale back the number of environments. But the main point is that you need to be able to do testing and validation in progressively kind of more stable environments until you get to a formal approval process for production. And then fundamentally, during the development process and the project planning process, you're going to want to think about all of the steps that are currently occurring, whether or not you're using EDI or not. What are the processes that are occurring, and how can we make these more effective? One of the most interesting things about using EDI is that a lot of times people just don't know what all it can do. And sometimes it can be kind of this set of assumptions that results in not fully taking advantage of some of the capabilities. And we're going to go into some specific examples of what it can do. But if you look at, different industries, for example, the automotive industry, the kind of workflows that you're going to be able to take advantage of and that are designed into X12 or EDI FACS or other standards for EDI, what you'll find is there are some very specific, document types that will apply to your industry, and there are best practices for how to use those. So you're going to want to understand, first of all, what are the workflows and what is your current business process? What are some edge cases? And then what are the document types that might apply? And any that you don't know very well, you're going to want to dig in and make sure that you kind of get up to speed on those with a vendor like Clarity, who's done this before and can say, no, that's not how that's typically used. Or, yeah, that's exactly right. This is a great use case for you guys. And they really need to be a vendor who's proactive and is going to make recommendations based on their experience. You don't want to work with somebody who's just coming into this for the first time. Another thing ultimately is, setting up a kind of infrastructure where you are using kind of this transactional integrity mechanism. A VAN is a very proven mechanism, but there are other mechanisms within the EDI space that are more modern. And although it's not necessary and there's a lot of tendency toward VANs, there are other mechanisms for this transactional integrity that we can employ, and just kind of walk you through the pros and cons of those as well. And ultimately, what you're going to end up with is a kind of capability to put a kind of first phase, or maybe it's an upgrade of your current existing EDI capability, put that into place, and then incrementally make improvements over time. That's one of the biggest things that I would encourage folks to see this as, is make successful incremental kind of progressions as opposed to doing everything at once. Whenever you're dealing with automating data between back office and front office systems, it can be very cumbersome when you run into edge cases, right, Ron?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So, I mean, yeah, it like ultimately, especially if you try to roll something out at scale, and, this is something that kind of can become a reality whenever you get into it. And it kind of can bounce off of a lot of people whenever they haven't actually done this before. But you really want to kind of think through all of the different workflows and the edge cases as a best practice. And then exercise those with any changes to your EDI system. So there are different document types, there are different kind of requirements for the data. And a lot of times what we've seen is that the data itself will cause problems whenever we're trying to interchange between the systems. And, ultimately, this is something that we would say is a best practice as well, is like being aware of the data, having an approach to dealing with errors and issues that are going to occur, and then having a testing mechanism to be able to actually progress changes through a pipeline and have a more and more stringent and formal approval process as you get toward your production environment.
Yeah, and if the audience is kind of wondering what are the most common things done with EDI, at least from a sales perspective, when I'm talking to clients, one of the bullets here talks about inventory and warehouse. That's kind of the second. The biggest one's just the orders, right? So, kind of the example I gave you about Laser Pros a minute ago, I can connect into, let's say, for example, I have an e-commerce website. Chris and I sell a lot of tools, but we only warehouse about 10,000 tools. The other 50,000 tools in our catalog are all drop shipped from vendors. Now, we can connect using EDI to all of those vendors for numerous reasons, right? One, they're going to send us a list of all the products that we can sell in a file, and we're going to pick up that file, and that's what's going to populate our catalog. That could also populate what their cost is to us, so we know what the uplift should be. That could also populate the inventory count that they have in stock if we want to show real-time stock counts of products available, even from our vendors that are going to be drop shipped, right? Kind of like today in the world, we have a run on chips, right? We're short on chips. So even if all those chips were drop shipped from a vendor, I know a lot of my clients are like, oh, it's just drop ship. They're never going to run out. And so on the e-commerce implementations we put out, they'll have us just put not counted. So it always just shows in stock. Well, what happens if that vendor runs out of stock and your website, meanwhile, starts showing in stock and you're selling more and more and more units and you're sending all these orders that cannot be fulfilled? So one of the things you might want to do is this inventory and warehousing where you're knowing exactly how many units are where from each vendor. So you could have multiple vendors selling the same or supplying the same product, and you know where to drop ship. That would be one simple option to be able to do that. Anyway, that was just one I wanted to mention because the warehousing, low stock, being able to automatically kick off a purchase order. So if in an e-com system we roll out, if I say I'm stocking items in my warehouse, but I want my inventory to be a little more automated, we can set up low stock counts that when I get below X number of units for a particular part, it could automate, generate the file, and place an order with one of the vendors to
Absolutely
replenish that supply.
And I just want to throw a
So
few
let's
examples.
bounce over. Yeah,
I was
go
going
ahead,
to say,
please.
sorry to interrupt. I'll throw a few more examples out there, and this might flow into kind of some of our future slides, so I'll keep it pretty high level. But I think that was a great idea to just kind of throw out examples here to start with. And that what you just stated, Ron, is absolutely kind of the crux of a lot of what we see in the e-commerce space is this idea of, updating inventory, pricing information on an e-commerce site, for example, being able to populate orders and kind of progress them through the fulfillment process and, then provide updates back to the site so the site can show to the user what is the status of your order, for example. These are just kind of core fundamentals. There are some interesting edge cases per industry where, like you said, a lot of our clients end up being buying groups, and the buying groups, they will do, in many cases, they'll do drop ships. And whenever they're doing drop shipping, they tend to have sophisticated ordering models where they're having to do split shipping and split payment because it is a group purchasing organization or buying group. And by its nature, you're going to kind of see these type of, relatively complex scenarios. EDI can handle that perfectly, and it's excellent for handling those types of scenarios. And what's really cool is we can just dynamically split out these, complex orders and then send them out to the manufacturers or the distributors who we're going to be placing the order with dynamically. And that is so powerful as a buying group to be able to scale up and know that this process is completely locked in. And, the more orders you get, the better it is. You don't have to staff up more, et cetera. And then similarly, like you were saying with the inventory, another example that we've worked in is extensively with EDI is dealing with companies that have maybe multiple organizations, multiple legal entities that are transferring stock between them, or they might have multiple locations. And so we'll do the buy online, pick up in store or BOPIS. And there's some mechanical accounting that has to happen to take care of all the back office accounting, all the inventory management. Maybe there's a store transfer that we need to do where the item is actually being fulfilled from a warehouse and it goes onto a truck. And that truck is kind of in the distribution network for this multi-location retail, arm of a company. And, we've done this before where there's a direct drop shipping component of a company and then a retail arm of a company. And there may be different organizations. You can see how complicated this can get when you're trying to scale everything rapidly. And that is the beauty of EDI. We can sit down with you in a discovery process, go through what the specific workflow is, document that out, and then execute on that using EDI. It's so powerful. One more example that I want to briefly share is the medical space. And these are just examples to kind of get you thinking about scenarios that might apply for you. And in particular, encourage you to think about the possibilities with EDI. Okay. Because you may not have been exposed to all of these concepts. And we just want to encourage you that there's probably a lot that's possible that can be automated that you may not just be aware of yet. And we'll also include links in the description so you can dig in if you'd like, either by contacting us or by looking at additional resources with more detail. But in the medical space, it's pretty interesting because a lot of the EDI has its own format, and it's HL7v2, HL7v3. It's essentially an EDI type of model, but catered to the medical space. And it's really, really powerful because this kind of flat file format is very standardized across the entire industry. And so there are some really incredible things you can do. If you're not aware of these, it includes things like being able to, look at of course, patient information, appointments, detailed records, and transferring these detailed records. But you can also do some pretty powerful things with inventory management, making sure that the steps of a procedure are available. It gets very granular as to what you can automate, and set things up so that whenever we get a patient in and it's this type of patient, then we have this workflow kickoff, and then we reorder inventory because we know we need this testing device. Maybe it's a blood test and an x-ray or something because it's this type of patient. Okay, well, we're going to, like you said, Ron, go and back order those supplies or reorder them, etc. And being able to do these kind of things in each particular space in your industry, it can be what allows you to kind of put your focus into growing your business instead of dealing with all the logistics, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I'm sitting here as you're talking, coming up with all these ideas. I'm remembering back in the day, back in the early 90s, I was the director of IT at WordPerfect. And back then, we really didn't have an ability to connect to all of our third-party vendors that we dealt with. And so one of the things that we had with our email system, back then called GroupWise, was an async gateway. And I used that async gateway. It was an inbound and outbound mailbox, and you could send these flat files. You could email to it, you could fax to it, you could do anything to it. And basically, it was kind of like a van back in the day, right? Where anytime I went out to integrate at client sites and I was rolling out big sites like we were doing Chrysler and the Postal Service and Callaway Golf and Shell Oil, every time I'd go out there and they would say, well, we have this third party machine and we have no idea when it's down. And I'm like, well, when it goes down, does it send a file? We'd say, yes. Okay, well, great. Well, let's send that file. And I would just point it at the async gateway and give it an inbound queue. And we could automate the reporting and basically the forwarding of these files either through email or appointments or reporting system or anything. So almost clear back in the day, 30 something years ago, showing my age now. Back then it was almost like an EDI, but it was for, a communication system, which is kind of what we're doing. Well, now that we've gone through a number of the examples, let's go through, and we've kind of already talked about this. You talked about X12 being the US-based one and the EDI FAQ. I always talk about it. I call it EDIFAX, just EDI FAQ, the European one. It's also become so popular that there's an organization, if you want to go out to their website, it's cxml.org, that they've standardized for the commerce companies, that so many companies are talking that when you set up these different file types and you set up these different connections, if they use a different file type and because they're all flat files, you can kind of name some of the fields anything that you want. But if you do that, let's say, for example, I say given name instead of first name, and I dump that file in there and it goes and grabs a given name. Well, then I have to have a template. They call it a DTD, a definition template document, that says, oh, for this particular vendor I'm connecting to, grab the given name field and map that over to our first name field. So setting up these connections can take a little time if you have to have unique DTDs. So there was an organization, back in, I don't remember what it was, 1994, 1996, something like that, that defined a commerce XML standard for EDI file exchange. And that's at the cxml.org, and that kind of standardized. So we've got a number of different formats. You've got XML and CXML, and you've got the X12 and the EDI fax. Is there anything else you want to cover before we actually go into the file numbers and the file types? I think we've kind of covered most of this, but is there anything we've missed on the different types of file formats?
Nothing major. I'll just reinforce to kind of close it out that this is something that is very kind of low effort and very critical, and you should really see it as a blocker, and something that you need to clearly understand, what you're going to do whenever you're dealing with different standards across different kind of vendors that you work with, or, buyers, etc. Not a huge technical issue necessarily, unless you don't get it up front.
Yeah.
And so do plan on this. This is something you want to think about subconsciously, is like, this is a big deal. It's not necessarily complicated, but you got to figure this out. So with that, yeah, I think we can dive in and look at these actual document types now.
Great. So basically the way this works is, and then I'm going to have Chris go into the actual hard details. So I'll do it at the high level layman's terms. If I'm going to dump an order into a directory and into this SFTP directory, and they pick up this file and they go to process it, this inbound file has a header. This is an email, this is an order, this is a tracking status, this is a purchase order to replenish stock. This is a 897 acknowledgement that I received your file, whatever it is. That it's almost like the header information of each file type, and each file type has a format, and that lets the system know how to and what to expect when it engages that file. So I know I've probably said that not very technically, but do you want to dive in now and talk specifically about the types and some of the most common numbers that we use?
Absolutely. And this is something that we can show some different screenshots of some of the workflows. And we'll also reference some sites that have really like detailed, comprehensive lists of per industry kind of workflows. And we really recommend that you take a look at this, because what we've found whenever we're working with clients is a lot of times they just don't know what's possible with X12, especially with like automating specific kind of nuances. So here we're showing, maybe a standard set of kind of formats, but or document types. But one of the things that I wanted to do, Ron, is just kind of walk the audience through a specific example or two. And I guess just to that end, one of the typical workflows is within the retail industry. And so within the industry, you will typically see things like a price catalog first. So you've got to get the catalog itself, and that's going to be an 832. And, there may be more to this that makes sense in your particular case. Then we'll typically get an order, which is an 850, an order change, the 860. And, we can kind of keep going down this list, but you can see the picture here. That just kind of shows how this goes. And most folks are pretty familiar with the fact that you can basically place an order and then get an order response, and maybe even the 856 with the delivery. But the thing that I think is interesting is a lot of folks don't necessarily know about remittance advice or a sales report or, inventory report. And so these are some additional document types that you can even see that the receiving advice and the inventory report are the same document type in the sales report, the same document type, but it's used for different things. And so that's what we want you to take away from this particular example. And then just to kind of walk through a few more, if you go to the auto industry and want to use that, That's a similar thing, but different specifics. So again, we're showing the image on the screen here, and you can see that you have this idea of delivery instructions, a daily call off, a shipping notification, receiving advice, then an invoice, a credit note possibly, and then payment advice. And so it's just really, really powerful to be able to use these. What you'll see is they're the same documents in many cases. Like the 810 is used twice in this auto example, but it's got a different set of criteria in the data, and that kind of drives a different workflow. So it's not just the different document types, but it's actually the kind of the data or the types or flags within the record itself. And this can also drive some really powerful workflows to automate the process internally for you. And there are a myriad of these examples. These are just two we wanted you to see. So you can see that we can not only take advantage of some maybe document types that you haven't seen before, but also that the same document type itself can be used for multiple phases of the process, right, Ron?
Yeah, and I don't remember how many files, but it surprised me. I always thought it was just, orders, status, purchase orders, things like that. But the first time I went out to the X12 site and started looking at different file formats, and I'm going to pop the URL up on the screen here so you guys can go see that. I was surprised at how many different document types there are. So even if you don't really know exactly what's available to you, if you just go to this site and just look through the different types and kind of read the different types of documents and what they can do, it'll give you an idea that, and Chris kind of mentioned it before when he started talking about split shipping and drop shipping, and you started getting into some of the little more complex things. EDI can handle all of that and has for decades. So you can just imagine that any of the different types of buying group or online e-commerce, custom bulk purchasing, split order, drop ship, refill inventory counts, all that kind of stuff, multiple warehouse locations, all of that is very easily done. We say flat files, so everybody thinks it's simple, but it can still be extremely secure. It can be near real time. You can set up pingers that auto notify, like with a van, that there's a file, so go pick it up. So now we're only waiting a few seconds. So even though it's flat file and it's file exchange, where normally on most EDI, you're setting up and say, oh, go scan every 5 or 15 minutes. And if a file comes in, process it. So sometimes there can be a delay, 15, 30 minutes before something gets processed. When you start introducing vans and things like that, not only do you get the additional security, you can start getting the notifications to go pick things up immediately. So it might only be a few second delay, right? We call that near real time. So EDI is definitely a powerful option for you. The next one we're going to look at is basically, we'll talk about the notification system, and I just briefly touched that. But I want you to dive in, Chris, to the different types of notifications and why would we need notifications? I mean, if I dump a file off and at least I get the one notification that it was received, is there really anything else that I need to know?
Yeah, good question. So, yeah, I think one of the interesting things here is that you can see that this industry has evolved, just kind of this space overall, and it's really become capable of doing, I mean, literally most, if not everything, that you see with other API formats. And although it's not mechanically true that a car can become an airplane, in the same way EDI isn't, it's not going to become something it's not as far as APIs. There are certain limitations.
Right.
But I guess you can put wings onto a car, can't you? If you need to. And so, like, the big thing I would say, without getting into, super, super detailed edge cases, would be being able to get mechanical acknowledgement of the document sent and receipt of documents. So you've sent something and it's been received. And then the document on, if you're a recipient of a document, hey, you've received a document. And so this kind of allows this real-time kind of lightweight communication, like a pub sub, publish and subscribe, or a service bus. But the other thing is, mechanically within the organization, these acknowledgments around, purchase order acknowledgement, a shipment notice, possibly a warehouse transfer notification, things like that, where this is going to be kind of driven off of different events. So you can have an event driven workflow that's going to occur. And by properly setting this up with the notifications, you can basically allow the computer systems, whether it's a van or if it's an AS2 or, whatever mechanism is going to allow this communication to happen within the EDI network. Then you're able to kind of allow your systems to follow these rules and take advantage of these different notifications to communicate with each other, where it would otherwise be people physically communicating in some form, right? So there can be an order placed online for a store that is in the southeast region of the country, but the item is only available in the warehouse that's on the northwest part of the country. And so there needs to be a transfer, and maybe it's a weekly transfer that occurs that's just part of the fulfillment network that, hey, if anything needs to go from northwest to southeast, every week we're going to do that. And so someone places this order online, and little do they know that all they're seeing is the kind of the lead time, which their item will be in the store in a week. But what happens behind the scenes? Well, the order gets credited to the store that's close to the person that's buying online. They're going to pick it up in the store, and that store gets the credit within the accounting system. But there's also a transfer of the inventory, possibly from the warehouse that's in the northwest down to the warehouse that's in the southeast. And let's say for whatever reason that person cancels their order after the item has already been transferred. Okay, well, now what are you going to do? You have all these systems playing together. And so you really want to take advantage of notifications, because we need to account for the fact that the northwest warehouse transferred the inventory to the southeast warehouse. So now it's in the inventory in the southeast warehouse. And we also have an order cancellation, so we need to deal with that. And, we need to make sure that the store that was getting credit for the order doesn't get credit for it, and on we go. And so the notifications can really be seen as sort of like an automation if we're watching them properly and executing against them properly. They're like essentially a workflow that we can fire off from these notifications.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. So that's kind of the introduction. Now, there are many more things about EDI that we can talk about, but that's kind of today's webinar with EDI with regards to buying groups. Was there anything else before we tie this one off, Chris, that you wanted to cover on EDI?
I would just say, whenever you're looking for a vendor and you're considering your options, make sure that you look for someone who has experience in your particular area. And if you're going to be leveraging some specific details, like if you're going to be working with EDI within e-commerce, for example, or the healthcare industry, HIPAA, for example, it really does make sense to work with someone who has kind of done this and been there and done that before in your particular space. And they can bring in these different kind of capabilities and experiences from successfully implementing what all is possible with EDI. Don't be afraid to, consider really looking at it as well as a long-term investment. A lot of times what we see with clients is they will kind of, just kind of halfway get started into something like EDI, thinking that it's just this one thing that we need, and then they'll still be using it 5 to 10 years later. And so we really want to encourage you to look at it as a potential long-term investment. Even if that doesn't end up being the case, look at it as an investment that might go for 5 to 10 years, and make sure that you put the planning in up front so that you can execute really well, and just be aware of some of the potential opportunities and potential risks going into it. But yeah, I think that's a great segue into our next talks, because we're going to be kind of helping really get into the weeds on those in some of our next discussions. So with that, that's it for me, Ron.
All right, great. Well, so for the audience, thanks again for attending today. If you enjoyed today's webinar, please smash that like button, subscribe to the channel. As a reminder, this EDI buying group webinar today was number 3 in a series of 12 webinars about buying groups. So make sure to check the channel, check the playlist for buying groups and all the other chapters. I'll also try to link to directly all the other videos in this series in the description. So look down in the description below for the URLs that Chris talked about, the different formats, the different websites. And then at the very bottom of the description, I'm going to include all the links to all the other chapters. So
Thanks, Ron.
thanks again. Appreciate you. Thanks, Chris. Bye for now.
Thanks, everyone. Bye for now.